I think the Presidio is a quintessential microcosm of the history of the Trans-Mississippi West, one of the longest active duty military installations west of the Mississippi River. At one time, that was one of the longest lived, continually occupied military installations from the 18th century all the way up until nearly the end of the 20th century. There was even a movement afoot in the 19th century to say, why are these army guys having this fort? They would make great real estate for the rich and famous. We don't all have to live up on Nob Hill.
Today's interview is the second in my series on the Presidio of San Francisco, the celebration of its 250th anniversary. And today I'm talking to Dr. John Langelier, who has written a very well-researched and in-depth book about the Presidio and its history, all the way from its founding 250 years ago to its evolution into a park and a public space that everyone can enjoy. And along the way, how it evolved from a small imperial outpost of Spain into a bastion by the bay, as the book is titled. So, without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Dr. John Langelier. It's a real honor to talk to you and to go in depth about your book on the Presidio of San Francisco. Welcome.
What a pleasure. Now, you said we wanted to do the entire program in Spanish. Is that not correct, Professor?
Pues sí,
So,
sí. Adelante.
No, I think if they want to be really bored, they can read my first volume with my friend Dan Rosen on the Spanish and Mexican period. But we'll stay with English today, even though my English sometimes is broken. So
okay, we'll do. But we'll also include a link to that work, which is really interesting for historians or people really studying the early history of the Presidio. So, Dr. John, can you tell us a little bit about your background? You've written a wonderful book, Bastion by the Bay, the Presidio of San Francisco, and I'd love to hear a little bit how you got into this, what brought you to this book, and what's your background?
well, actually, I came from the founding place of San Francisco. I'm sitting within blocks almost from the Presidio of San Agustin de Tucson, which was the Presidio that essentially replaced the Tubac Presidio, where Moraga was, and others. Actually, Moraga was born in Santa Cruz County, our neighboring county, and his comandante of the Presidio of San Ignacio de Tubac, where it was kind of the launching point for the expedition, and ultimately the launching point for the overland trek. So you literally, if you came to visit me, we could get in a car and cover a lot more territory than they did, but stop at some great Mexican restaurants along the way and have our chocolate and our bacanora and other things. And so I
Sign me up.
literally, well, actually, I want to do a tour someday, a sober tour, however. But because I lived here and because essentially my first mentor was Sid Brinkerhoff, who wrote a book called Lancers for the King, which is an interesting take on things from a fellow from an old Dutch New York family, to get me started on my road here. And so ultimately, I knew about San Francisco, but never got any further north than Los Angeles in my early career. Matter of fact, I went to the University of San Diego for my undergraduate and my master's degree under Ray Brandes, who was a descendant of a leather jacket soldier, a soldado, Lancer, down in San Diego. And Ray essentially planted even more of a seed when I went off for my doctoral program in Milwaukee, of all places, and I was to teach a course on the borderlands because our professor who normally taught the course was going off on sabbatical, the dream of all academics, that sabbatical year. I found out that there was a job available in San Francisco, and as a starving PhD student, I dutifully called back and said, I can't come and do this right now. And they said, no problem. We replaced you anyway by some young upstart by the name of Francis Bannock, John Francis Bannock. No one had ever heard of that man, evidently. Of course, he was one of Bolton's star students. And so I was replaced by another great Jesuit and came out to San Francisco and spent essentially almost 7 years there before I went on for my to return to a doctoral program in a separate place. And I thought, well, I owe these people, so I will do my dissertation on the Presidio. So what you have in your hand was a dissertation in the early 1980s, but like most of us, you want to forget your dissertation and the pain and all the mistakes and all the things you made. So I put it off until a couple of years ago when my college roommate, Dr. Blaine Lamb, who had written a brilliant work on early Jewish pioneer merchants and politicos in Arizona, was ill with cancer, and I kept prodding him, Blaine, this is great. You have to publish your dissertation. So he did, thank God. And I said, well, if you tell somebody to do something, you're supposed to back. So I finally got off my duff and University of North Texas Press, who did an earlier book related to Frederick Remington and the Buffalo Soldiers with me, were naive enough to think that this might be a topic worthy of killing trees. And so finally, about 30 years later, this is what you have in your hand. Much improved because of some friends from the Park Service and elsewhere who went through the manuscript because it truly was painful to return to all my old yellowed notes. In those days, we took notes. We didn't use laptops to take our notes, and so we didn't go online.
Wow. So, can you again give us a maybe start from the beginning? What it well, let's go even let's talk big picture. What would you say is the significance? What is the Presidio San Francisco? What is its significance for people who may have never been there?
That's a great question. I was sitting in my office, was in the 1863 Army, post Army hospital one day, and an elegant lady drove up in a Bentley with the gloves and the hat and all those things that in the 70s people still did, and came up the stairs and said, I've lived in San Francisco all my life. What is the Presidio? I've never been here. So that was somewhat of a shocking question, but still one. I think the Presidio is a quintessential microcosm of the history of the Trans-Mississippi West, bridging everything from pre-contact, because of course California's rich heritage going back who knows how long with First Nations, Native peoples, with their very diverse cultures, languages, customs, and such, through the Spanish, through the Mexican period, literally all the way through every major conflict that the country had had from World War One, Spanish American War, the Pacific adventures in the Philippines, and the expansion from a small kind of constabulary force to an international power, to ultimately the Cold War, and with the end of the so-called Cold War, the end of the Presidio's necessity and its conversion by happenstance, chipping away from Angel Island with the state parks to what became the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, essentially starting with Fort Point, one of the magnificent urban parks. And so we literally have the opportunity to look at a span of history that goes back millennia, and yet today is one of the most spectacular places one could ever visit. And unfortunately, even though our national parks such as Yellowstone or Yosemite are wonderful in the Grand Canyon, where I would go as a child often, they're not always accessible to people. And so that park being in an urban environment it's a gateway to other national parks. And ironically, I think one of the things I found the most fascinating when I resurrected the project was some of the pushback from higher ups in the national park in Washington, D.C. to say, oh my God, we can't have these urban parks. They're taking away from real parks. And because there's only so much, money in the coffers to run our parks, sadly to say. And as a consequence, some of the pushback was, we don't want this to be a park. But thank God other heads rose and said, no, we also don't want it to be another development for the posh people who can afford the wonderful homes up on Infantry Terrace or whatever. So it's the best of all worlds. It's kind of the Leo Marx machine in the garden with all the architectural features and the military construction and the bridge anchoring on one side over Fort Point. And it's also kind of Frederick Law Olmsted with the forestation plan and making something that was sand dunes, which to the average Eastern person, oh my God, this is terrible. We can't live in a possible place like this. All there are is pulgas and winds, fleas and wind. So it embraces so many topics architecturally, historically, environmentally, that if you never get to visit any other national park in this country, which would be a tragedy, you could encompass many of those fantastic qualities in this one place, from its history to its prehistory to the environmental concerns that were there, including originally back in the late 19th century, someone trying to get a permit from the military to put wind machines on the the, the beach areas where Chrissy Field, et cetera, everything is today to generate power, electrical power.
Wow,
Nothing
when
new
was
under
that?
the
What
sun, I
what what
guess.
was that all about?
Well, somebody thought if you could generate, there were waves, actually wanted to do wave powers, not wind machines, but the waves would be a source of electricity. And of course, electricity was the big new thing. All the batteries in San Francisco, the new ones at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, they were electrified. And there was also a plan. I can defend San Francisco, Edison said, with electricity. Essentially, I guess you electric the fleet as it came in from whoever was going to invade that week. And of course, the beauty of all those sites today is every one of those sites that was built with government money and each generation of the arms race never fired a shot in anger.
Yeah, so that makes me think the Presidio exactly. It started out as a defensive position for the Spanish and eventually evolved into a U.S. Army base. So, can you give us a little bit of an overview of who was throughout its history, who was being defended from whom and against whom?
It was kind of the perfect circular history. We tend to be linear in our approach in Western areas, but many native peoples and others have a more circular view. The Russians were coming, according to the Spanish, and we needed to do something about those pesky people taking away our otter pelts and such. And so we also are Catholic and they're Russian Orthodox, and we can't have that happen because we both have the truth faith and we know ours is the truest. So it's the Russians at the beginning, and at the end, it's the Russians again. Although at one point in time, a thought was when the Presidio was closing that Gorbachev might come and have his peace initiative there in his headquarters for an international peace organization, which is kind of a lovely thought. But it was definitely to protect against the Russians and to ultimately the British, who had been since the time of Drake coming up and down the coast, and ultimately the Spanish came up with the wherewithal, such as it was, to finally string out the empire as far north as San Francisco and indeed up into Nootka Sound into what is the Pacific Northwest today. But that was also their death knell. The empire had gone beyond what they could possibly sustain. And so it was the Russians that ultimately brought them in. It was ultimately their demise when they came up here, and the Russians were really not the threat. And indeed, there was trade between the Russians because, once people have found out that the enemy isn't really the enemy and no one cares about you and the home government back in Mexico City and certainly not back in Madrid, you have to survive. And there's the romance of Rezanov and of course the Arguello's daughter of the whole situation where he goes off and we're going to cement the Capulets and the Montagues. So we have that story, and of course the Mexican Revolution finally working its way out of the central part of Mexico, and the Grito finally in the 1820s seeing a change in the flag, but not really a change in personnel. By the time Mexico arrives, many of the soldiers are the descendants of the original soldados who garrisoned those presidios all the way from San Diego up to San Francisco, and the ultimate abandonment of San Francisco for a better opportunity, essentially, to survive in today's Sonoma. I guess the wineries were an attraction. It would have been for me as a soldier at any rate. But having said that, that kind of left a very weak position. And so those people they initially feared, the people coming from England, and the people coming from Russia were no longer the threat. The real threat, of course, will become the ever expanding uh, hand of manifest destiny, in this case led by John Charles Fremont, who was an heir to essentially an officer in the United States Army, but also a man on the take himself. And between that and secret orders that were sent by the Secretary of the Navy, that if war arises, which it ultimately does after the situation with Texas and the invasion of Mexico itself, take San Francisco. It's the important harbor, as Father Font called it, the harbor of harbors. You could have put every fleet in the world at one time in there and still had space not to add more vessels. And so that was the beginning of a long term from the 1840s all the way up through the base closure in the 1990s, one of the longest active duty military installations west of the Mississippi River. There are a few still today that are now longer lived. Fort Riley, Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, and even here to a certain degree Fort Huachuca from the 1870s. But at one time, that was one of the longest lived continually occupied military installations from the 18th century all the way up until nearly the end of the 20th century. And so it has that cache, if you will, of that long strand of history. So if you were an archaeologist, there's plenty of layers to dig down through the strata to find different cultures. Again, back to the initial people who were perhaps not as happy to see the Spanish or the Russians or anybody else as the Spanish themselves or the English speaking people later on.
So the United States takes control of the Presidio in 1846, and it sets about transforming it into, a modern military base. But that took a long time. Could you walk us a little bit through the stages of the evolution of the Presidio under U.S. management?
If you arrived like uh, Dana and before the mast, etc., just a little bit after the new flag had replaced it with the stars and stripes rather than the tricolor from Mexico, you wouldn't have known the difference virtually, other than the flag. They literally backfilled into the old adobes, some of which are somewhat surviving in the form of some of the walls of what had been the officers' club for many years thereafter. And it was a backwater, despite its strategic importance the country, not unlike the Spanish before them, had pushed out to the very edge of the earth in terms of manifest destiny as how far we could go until we decided we could go into the Pacific. But the technology was not there to link them together. There wasn't even a Pony Express at that time. So you're sending things around the Horn. There's no Isthmus of Panama being transversed with a canal and such. And so you're out there on your own. And even more so by the time the late 1840s comes, because one thing brings half the world, it seems, to San Francisco, and that is the Sutter's accidental discovery of gold in California and all that transformed the entire Bay Area, and for that matter, much of California, into what it would become later, because it would be a flood of people from around the world, English speaking people from as far away as Australia, people from the Hawaiian Islands who actually had been there prior to even the coming of the Anglos, and ultimately people from Asia, particularly from China. So it became truly a polyglot area that arose. And finally, by the 1850s, with the influx of obviously some species, gold was giving the government some power because some of that gold was going back to take care of the national treasury, so to speak, and fill the coffers. They began to build the first fortifications, of which today the best example, obviously, is the fort at Fort Point, or later on Fort Winfield Scott, as it was called, and was there to defend the arch under the bridge, I believe. I'm not sure. That's, of course, that was the brilliance of Strauss. Strauss couldn't bear to demolish a wonderful piece of masonry, the art of great brick making and laying and architecture in its own right. And so that arch protects the fort as opposed to the other way around, and a good place for Hitchcock to use for his movies too. I mean, whatever.
That's right.
So, having said that, a small infusion of funds start coming in, and that's still inadequate lots of great plans, but even trying to get land on the other side, on the Marin side, the headlands, which by that time were occupied by individuals, landowners, in court cases and all that sort of thing. Ultimately, it will be the American Civil War that will start sparking the need for these defenses to move forward. And but it's still, even then, it was a case of too little, too late. And the Navy was looked at up at the naval yard at Mare Island to be kind of the interim protection of the Bay Area rather than the fixed defenses. Although Alcatraz will start to be built, Alcatraz is a fort, Angel Island is a fort. The idea is you have that narrow golden gate that the enemy must come through. And if you can triangulate your fire from the Presidio, from the Marin headlands, from Angel Island, from Alcatraz, no one will get in and take over the great city of San Francisco, which didn't need to be destroyed by an enemy anyway, because it would burn down periodically for many times during the gold rush and thereafter. But ultimately, some of the funding would come. There would even be an ironclad built, the Comanche, to protect against the newer forms of ships, the Alabama or some of the Shenandoah, who might steam in any day and try and seize this great prize of San Francisco. And of course, there were all these supposed plots to take over San Francisco by uh, folks who were working undercover to seize weapons and to come into California, and vice versa, using California on filibusters to go into Mexico prior to the war. So it was always a hotbed of potential intrigue and spy networks and that sort of thing. But it never happened. One of them had a great miniseries, but no one ever asked me to write a script. So I guess it may have to wait for Kevin Costner or someone else. By
You
the
know,
post-Civil War period, they began to do some expanding, but the realization was by the late 60s, early 70s, that brick and mortar forts had seen their day the day that Fort Sumter had fallen. So Fort Point, while charming and gorgeous and one of my favorite places to go and have a picnic still to this day when I go back to the Bay Area, were outmoded. So were the cannons. They were not up to date. The European powers, including the Germans and definitely the British, had come up with new types of weaponry, new types of propellant. And so by the 1890s, money would become infused as we're starting to look beyond our shores to become an imperial power, to become a national player, that San Francisco would be reinforced under the so-called Indicat, Cot, and Taft boards, these artillery boards that had grand plans, who must have studied under brutalists before there were brutalists, because they are brutalist architecture before there was such a thing. But their form and function, what they had was form and function. But ironically, even at the time that these weapons of incredible destruction were being developed, and the architecture built to sustain them, although they built nothing overhead because aviation hadn't become a threat at the time. That's the same time that the Presidio was transformed from those sand dunes into a park-like atmosphere, following the plans that had been used in other places, such as Olmsted's work in New York and in Boston and elsewhere. And
so
as a
what
consequence,
what
the
years are we
Presidio
talking
becomes a
about?
much more desirable posting. As one of the Army brides of the period said, it was a gilt-edged assignment. If you wanted to go somewhere and be stationed somewhere, it wasn't in some post in Arizona. It was the Presidio, if you could at all swing it. And luckily, the artillery officers had the sway to be able to do that. Cavalry officers weren't too useful in San Francisco for some reason. I don't know why, but although they did have cavalry contingents, which we can talk about a little bit later on, that had a tie-in with the national parks by the turn of the early 20th century. So that transformation literally was for strategic purposes, but also for purposes of quality of life for the garrison. And interestingly enough, since the 1870s, an awareness that the growing city of San Francisco is no longer that village that burns down every couple of years. It's this magnificent jewel of in our country, competing in some respects with New York at the other end of the continent. and we have to put our best face forward for public relations purposes. Because there was even a movement afoot in the 19th century to say, why are these army guys having this fort? They would make great real estate for the rich and famous. We don't all have to live up on Nob Hill. We could take over this place that they just made look really cool for us now with these super vistas before there's the bridge, etc. And so the Army became acutely aware of that, so much so that if you go along Funston Avenue today, the little quarters that essentially were Sears and Roebuck assembled housing during the war for the expansion of the troops that were starting to come in, that they ultimately changed around the orientation. So their front porches today were originally the back porches in the 1850s and early 1860s. So we were showing our derriere to the city of San Francisco, including our privies and all our garbage that we're throwing out the back, into our backyards and such. They changed the orientation even to work for those homes to present a more Victorian, acceptable neighborhood that gave a better impression of the military there to the people who came to visit. And the biggest probably visitation came in July of 1876 for the centennial, when the great sham battle came and people descended like ants upon the Presidio to watch the battle to defend San Francisco. And unfortunately, it showed the weaknesses that the Presidio and its cousins around the Bay Area were ill-equipped to protect San Francisco from anything. I think that also ultimately had to do with funding coming through the various government resources as senators and congresspeople and such, that we can't have this happen. We need funding for, if you need it for Boston, we need it for San Francisco.
So can you tell us about that great sham battle? What was it? What took place?
Well, it's essentially probably a little more impressive than what happened for our 250th last week or so, a few weeks ago. It was to show the great San Francisco military might and how this city was now the new city on the hill, not the one that was founded somewhere with those Lafitte Easterners. And so they were supposed to sink the enemy fleet. Well, they couldn't hit the broadside of the barn. And one of the newspaper articles even said it, one of the older gentlemen, probably a Mexican War veteran, said, if I had a young kid who was in charge of this, in essence, I'd clobber him around the head and then go out there and sink it myself. That it was a true embarrassment. The military looked great. They had their army band, the fourth artillery band, and they had all the cavalry troops and artillery troops out in their smart uniforms with, believe it or not, with plumed helmets out of the British, and other uniforms that made them look like they might belong to the French army, because we weren't sure who we wanted to be at that time. Of course, after the Franco-Prussian War, it was no longer the French, but that's another story. And having said that, it was more of a great fiasco than a let's celebrate and show how we're defending San Francisco. So it may well have been, as I say, the beginning of a better catalyst to say we've got to do something different than what we have here. It's not necessarily the soldiers' fault. It's probably the fault of the fact that they have poor equipment, poor, particularly artillery and ordnance pieces, and these forts are completely outdated, and they couldn't sink a modern warship, which the dreadnoughts are just around the corner. The British, particularly, will bring the great British dreadnought to bear, and once that happens, eventually we have to do the same thing under Mahan. Upton and Mahan were the two great theorists, Mahan being the naval theorist, Upton, who died by his own hand a few doors down from my old office at Building 3 because of probably he had a tumor, a brain tumor. He was the great military genius of his time, but he was looking for an expansive army, an army that today's military would recognize, but was completely foreign to those veterans of the Mexican War and the Civil War, who were, even though people like Grant and Sherman and Sheridan were quite noted for their heroism and saving the nation, they were living in Napoleonic times in many respects, where Upton was living in essentially what would become the 20th century.
So
However, he wasn't listened to at the time.
so can we jump back a little bit then? You mentioned the Mexican War and the Civil War. What role did the Presidio play during the Civil War?
Civil War itself, it was a staging area for troops. Number one, as I had mentioned, the Navy is there kind of to do some of the protection, but there is Fort Point, there is Alcatraz with its citadel, which is kind of, it was almost like a feudal, uh, something that you would see in Scotland on an island, protect from the Normans attacking or what have you. And so it had that role to protect the Bay Area along with coordinating with the naval forces, but it was a staging and training area. So many troops would form there, including a group of individuals who became a cavalry unit that would be dispersed, the California 100, that would be dispersed to the west or east coast to fight in the Civil War. But some of these troops are also there to backfill because the Army had very few regular Army troops today at that time in California. And so they had to backfill with what would be commensurate to today's National Guard. There was really no National Guard in the same sense. There were these volunteer units that were similar. So those would form there, and they would use San Francisco to gear up, bring in the equipment from Benicia, the arsenal, train these individuals and disperse them, and not only in for other areas that had to be backfilled, like Arizona, where the California column would come in, but also in Northern California, where there was still the threat to the Americans at that time of a Native American uprising and ultimately the lava beds of the early 1870s. And the Modoc people would kind of be the death song of any possible resistance that would threaten in California. But there was that fear to send out troops to keep the Native Americans from arising, and internal subversion from people who were Asbury Harbinding and others who would be supposedly Confederate underlings who were there to subvert the government. So they supposedly kept the lid on and did disperse troops to other areas that had been abandoned by U.S. regular army forces that went to the east. So there was really the only regulars per se were the artillerymen who garrisoned those forts that had remained behind, again, to protect from a Confederate attack. And not only a Confederate attack from sea, but perhaps an internal Confederate uprising in San Francisco by these subversive forces that really didn't exist. But it made for a good story, and everybody got their promotion that way by staying there and governing. Because in war, there's opportunity for many people. So
Right. So, one of the things that you show in your book is with 1898 and the Spanish American War, the U.S. effectively becomes an empire. And from coast to coast, from two oceans. So the Presidio, of course, plays a role in that. How does the identity or the function of the Presidio change with this new sort of imperial America?
that's probably the high watermark in several respects for the Presidio, at least until later in the 20th century. And because we have now these Pacific ambitions, and we are pushing out to Hawaii, to the Philippines, to other areas. And of course, we need places like Hawaii for coaling stations and other purposes because the fleet can't just go out. This is also the time of Theodore Roosevelt, who is the, the arch imperialist, who is in many respects the father of the Great White Fleet. And the emphasis is on white. He is a white racist, and despite the fact that he supposedly tells the folks who are in the Ninth and 10th Cavalry, and the 24th and 25th Infantry, the people that are often referred to today in a misnomer, but well known as Buffalo Soldiers. Um, we will use this as a staging area, as a marshaling area, as a place to literally keep rotating troops in and out of the Philippines and elsewhere into the Pacific. And indeed, as part of a relief force that doesn't have to go, but are staged to go to lift the 55-day siege in Beijing, in Peking of that time. But luckily, they had Charlton Heston there, so he saved the day along with David Niven, so they didn't need the forces from the Presidio, San Francisco. But from then on, well through into the early 20th century, that's the place where the shiploads of troops come and go, and all the material to support them comes and goes. And when they rotate home, The next unit is already on its way and has replaced them. And one of those units is the 9th U.S. Cavalry, one of the black units with all white officers. It's a segregated, all the black units after the end of the Civil War for the first time in 1866, the U.S. Congress got something right. They allowed African Americans to serve in the U.S. Army. Prior to that, they were only in volunteer units, sometimes in militia units that were sometimes integrated, but most often the model was a segregated unit like this U.S. colored troops during the Civil War. These troops, some of them by that time have been the fellows who had been enslaved, had gone through, but by 1900, they've all retired. They put in their 30 years or so for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part. But amongst all these white officers and black soldiers is one extraordinary young officer, one of the only three graduates of West Point in the 19th century, and that is Charles Young. He's a young troop officer, meaning he's at the stage of what would be called a company, a battery, or a troop, Troop I of the 9th Cavalry. And he will return to the Presidio of San Francisco. And amongst other things, some of the photographs in the book show him leading a mock warfare because they would practice just as our soldiers today do war games and such. And we used to do in Europe, so-called reforge, or the return of forces to Europe in case the enemy attacked those godless communists from the Eastern Bloc. Our people would come from the United States and jump into their tanks that were all fueled up and ready to go and push back Ivan. Well, luckily that didn't happen either. But at that time, he would stage these particular. He was with one of the forces that would stage these mock attacks. And ultimately, when Theodore Roosevelt came to visit the Presidio of San Francisco, he would be escorted by the troops from the 9th Cavalry who were stationed there. They were some of the sharpest troops in the military. To the black soldier in the post-Civil War, this was not a job of work. It was a profession of arms. And these fellows would become, in many respects, crack troops, mainly because, unlike the fellow who had got off the boat from Ireland or Germany and was just looking for a job for 5 years and had nothing else to do because he couldn't find work, would join the army and maybe spend all 5 years or 3 years, depending on what time period you're talking about, enlistment, or go over the hill the first chance they could get to find something better after the army had gotten them to San Francisco or Arizona or wherever the case may be. Whereas these individuals spent 20 and 30 and sometimes beyond 30 years in the U.S. Army. It was prestige. It was money. It was 3 squares a day. And guess what? A guy with a gun with 40 and 50 of his buddies, who are some of the best marksmen in the Army, by the way, at this time. And marksmanship becomes a big deal after Little Bighorn when they found out that Custer's guys couldn't have hit any of the Lakota or Cheyenne if they had stood in front of them for the most part, because these were immigrants and others who had very poor training at the time. These guys were not going to be trucked with by the local civilian population, whether it's in San Francisco or whether it was in Cheyenne, Wyoming, or Tucson, Arizona, or elsewhere. These are crack soldiers. And so amongst them is Charles Young, but Young then gets the mandate along with the other troops who are garrison or commanded by white officers, that they're going to go off and become national park rangers. There's no National Park Service till 1916, as we know it. There are no rangers. There are people hired to do these sort of things, but Sequoia and Yosemite, for instance, sheep herders could come in and graze. People could come in and kill the livestock, chop down the magnificent trees. And so the first black superintendent of a national park, albeit an acting one, was Charles Young, the young Army officer from the 9th Cavalry with his Troop I. And so those soldiers from the Presidio of San Francisco and from the Presidio of Monterey the next year, who were also black soldiers from the same regiment, would become park rangers. Great job. Sure beats sharecropping in Alabama or Mississippi in the early 1900s. And certainly, once again, the fear of lynching was nothing. One of the other black units that comes through, actually, all 4 black units will be stationed at one time temporarily at the Presidio of San Francisco in the main on their way to the Philippines, because the Army didn't know what to do, like the nation at the time, with the so-called race question. So if we send them to the Philippines, we don't have to deal with people in Texas or Alabama or somewhere having an issue with black soldiers in their neighborhood, as well, unfortunately happened in 1906 during the so-called Brownsville period and riot. And so these soldiers would come through, and with one of the units, the 24th Infantry, is a officer, but he's not an officer as our friend Young will be, a West Pointer. He's a chaplain. The Army finally got around to understanding African Americans probably don't need Episcopalian white chaplains. It's just not quite the cultural norm. And so they will begin in the 1880s to introduce African American chaplains who are African American Methodists or Baptists or other denominations that were more conducive to the soldiers themselves. And one of them is Chaplain Ellen Ellensworth, who had been enslaved prior to the Civil War, but could read and write, which was forbidden in most places and punishable severely if that was found out. But he learned to read and write because his owner, quote unquote, he played with the young child, and they learned to read and write together. Of course, he didn't let that be known, but he enlisted in the Civil War, first as a volunteer, essentially as a medic, and then went on to become a Navy petty officer because the Navy was integrated in the pre-1900 period. Because on a ship about as big as my little 900 square foot house, how do you segregate a crew? And especially since
Right.
that crew wasn't just as they would become chefs and stewards and lackeys for the officers and doing all the cleanup work for the White Navy, the Great White Fleet, as I had mentioned, wasn't just white because of how the ships were painted. Um, he became a Civil War veteran, went to school, eventually acquired not only a bachelor's degree, but a master's degree in theology in the period soon after the Civil War in the 1870s and 80s, at a time that my French Canadian grandfather here in the United States probably spent no time in school and barely speak English. He became a chaplain, but his idea was to, during the Spanish American War, he became a recruiter and he brought in educated African Americans to his regiment for the betterment of those soldiers, because one of the reasons the soldiers would enlist in the U.S. Army who were black was the benefit of education. And so he wrote one of the first Army manuals on education when he was stationed in New Mexico, and he carried on that tradition. But it wasn't just the three R's. He wanted these soldiers to learn trades, to become chefs, to become butchers, to do things not unlike the Tuskegee idea that was going on at the same time with Booker T. Washington, to go back into society and go back into your communities with a trade, with a background, and leave the Army. Was so imbued with that thought that when he retired from the Army, and he, by the way, was injured in the Philippines accidentally, and so he came back to recuperate in the Bay Area, and they didn't know what to do with him, so they put him on Angel Island. He was the black chaplain of an all-white garrison at Angel Island, and that chapel is still standing today. And the day I win the California lottery is the day I will throw all the money I can at that chapel to have it restored and as a functioning chapel. We could make a fortune for weddings there alone. I mean, it would be a magnificent place to do so. But at any rate, he came back and founded this community that still bears his name, Ellensworth, a state park. He recruited retiring Army sergeants who could all read and write. They had administrative backgrounds because they had run their companies. And, you know, the Army is nothing ever changes. They fight more paperwork than they fight enemies. And so these fellows were educated. And he started a black community in the San Joaquin Valley. But they did one thing that was a little unique to many of these black communities that had grown up under the Exodusters and elsewhere. They drilled militarily once a week in case the local white community decided they didn't want blacks there. They probably wouldn't want to bother this particular community. There would be no one showing up wearing white sheets for the occasion. So he was an extraordinary individual. That community, regrettably, he left and returned to Los Angeles. And Los Angeles was a dangerous place for traffic in the early 20th century, as it is in the early 21st century. He was killed by a motorcycle driving
Uh,
by in hitting him. So
Wow.
a terrible, tragic end to a great man. So there are many of these stories, whether they're people, regrettably, who have been forgotten. Yes, Arthur MacArthur was at the Presidio, and in his day, Upton was a superstar. And yes, Roosevelt came there, and of course, Vinegar Joe Stilwell, after his wonderful exploits in the China, Burma, India area, would come back and command Sixth Army for a short period of time. But the real people are those unknown people, the Moragas, who still have descendants living in California, the
That's right.
privates, the sergeants, not just the high ranking officers who had the magnificent quarters and the best posting one could ever possibly get in the world, except maybe Boston or maybe in New York. But this was the premier, again, gilt edged assignment that everybody dreamt of. If they had to go somewhere and it wasn't heaven, then San Francisco would be the next best bet at the Presidio.
So that brings us to um, World War One, the run up to World War One, and of course, General Pershing his name is there at the Presidio. Can you tell us a little bit about this period, World War One, and then into World War Two?
Absolutely. Well, of course, we're not quite looking at World War One. Our President Wilson is run on a ticket of he kept us safe, for and preserved democracy and kept us out of war. Well, that wouldn't happen. We're more concerned at this time with the border. Strangely enough, between the United States and Mexico, something we don't talk about anymore because it's not even an issue. But it was evidently in the period of the early 20th century, and indeed so, that same group, the Ninth Cavalry, would be posted on the border to Arizona, along with ultimately all the black cavalry and infantry units would rotate in and out of Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, etc. And so Pershing is called away. He's the fair-haired boy. Roosevelt sees him at San Juan Hill in that famous charge that put him into the White House, then called the mansion, the executive mansion, not the White House. And Roosevelt plucks him out, and he's barely a captain. And he says, that man is bullying. He should be something. And well, you can't promote him. There's a system in the Army. You would go into a regiment and you would serve in the same regiment from second lieutenant to captain. And after you made captain, you could go into any other regiment where there was an opening for a major if you were the senior captain in that branch. So the senior captain in the cavalry, the next time some old guy died or, like me, retired, then you would go in and, oh my God, I finally got to be a major and I'm only 53 years old. They used to say your bar, meaning on your shoulder straps as a lieutenant or whatever, would turn silver uh, after your hair did. So basically, um, this was Pershing's big chance to go off to the border because Roosevelt says, okay, I can't make you a major, but I can make you a general. You don't ever have to be a major, lieutenant colonel, or a colonel. I can make you a general. So he becomes a brigadier general. It doesn't hurt that Pershing has married Frances E. Warren's daughter, the lovely Miss Warren, whose father is probably the most important Republican next to Roosevelt at, at this time of TR. And so that doesn't hurt his career. And so he goes off to head all the troops going into Mexico, particularly after the raid by Francisco Teodoro Arango, Pancho Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico. So we send in an invasion force to Mexico for the second time, the first time under Winfield Scott, etc., during the Mexican War. And while he's gone, the quarters, which stood essentially across from what had been the officers' club and near where the flagpole still resides today, the house burned. He had a black enlisted man staying with the family. They used to call him a striker, that a guy was there to take care of whatever the family needs were. Got the son out, but the wife and daughters died. So Pershing tragically is now left as a widower. His one son, Joseph, survives. And supposedly for years thereafter, he will take care of that soldier who tries to save the family. And indeed, that soldier ends up with burns and lung and issues and everything, and is hospitalized and is never quite himself again either. So Pershing now has had his practice march. He's gone into New Mexico. We've mobilized the Army. We have literally 100,000+ National Guardsmen and Army troops on the border. This is our practice for the big war that we're not going to ever get into. But after 1917, Pershing now is not just a brigadier general, but Frederick Funston, who was kind of the darling of the old days and became the hero in the Philippines, who was a guy who had read a book on military strategy, like TR had read a book on tactics before he went and led supposedly the Rough Riders of San Juan Hill as a cavalry colonel. Um, we would have Funston passes away with a heart attack, and he's kind of the heir apparent to everything. There's a few other officers, but Pershing leaps ultimately to become the general of the armies, the only four-star general except for U.S. Grant to have worn that insignia during the time well into the period of the Second World War. So Pershing goes off. The Presidio of San Francisco has really decent defenses by now, but they're now training a lot of these National Guardsmen and others groups who who actually had done some training there themselves uh, to learn to go to warfare. And so, God forbid, the sacred Presidio Golf Club becomes a place where you dig trenches. You talk about divots; they're digging trenches on the ninth hole. For goodness sakes, this is just unconscionable. But they trained the soldiers there, some of whom will go off to the Siberian expedition, because we've decided that after the fall of the Tsar and the coming of the Bolsheviks, we had to do something to stop this evil of communism. And so troops from the Presidio now are marshaled, and once again, some of those soldiers who are going off to the Philippines, Ninth Cavalry soldiers, are sent off to Siberia. What have we done now? We were at the Presidio at one time, and Manila wasn't bad, and we married a lot of local women and such, and raised our families there. And we're off to Siberia, but luckily that doesn't last very long, and we come home. So the Presidio from that point forward becomes a real command and control element for the part of the Pacific, all the way, all essentially into the time that we've built up Fort Shafter and others in Hawaii as our most advanced base. But the Presidio still retains a high priority level coastal defenses. We begin to build Crissy Field and understand that aviation the horse soldier is going to be replaced by horsepower. And one of those horsepower things are aviation. And so Crissy Field is built, and we have the embryo of that type of thing. We have new coastal defenses that have overhead protection, so that it's such as Fort Funston, where you have 16-inch guns that can lob something as big as a Volkswagen 16 miles or more out to sea. Aim for the Farallones and see what we can hit. And obviously, we didn't quite learn that that wasn't what the Japanese had in mind when they attacked Pearl Harbor. They didn't bother with any of the coastal defenses on Oahu. They were a non-player and not important to their overall scheme and strategy. But the Presidio from there on takes on that role, and then ultimately, in the post-war, when those people who had been the enemy, we began to rebuild Germany and rebuild Japan. The new enemy is our former ally, the Soviet Union, first under Stalin, then later under the numerous changes to Khrushchev. The Cold War is there, and so it became a center of command and control for anti-aircraft with the various evolutions of the Nike missile systems that are built up and ring the Bay Area to protect the Bay Area, but also from Soviet bombers coming over, etc. And there are even batteries, God forbid, while people are protesting across the bay in Berkeley. And I don't think, luckily, the people didn't know that. They probably wouldn't have slept as well at night. Uh, they came full circle. But by the time the Cold War ends, theoretically under Reagan, there's no need for those defenses in great part. There's new types of defense works, and our submarine fleets and that sort of thing. So it's an anachronism. And it's just the fact that people keep fighting it and fighting it in the military, but ultimately it's an unaffordable situation to have a major installation. When I was there, we had a battalion of MPs. It was the safest place in the entire Bay Area, despite the fact that Yeah, they did have a murder under Sean Connery, but that got taken care of, by Sean Connery
I saw that movie too.
yeah, yeah, yes, I can tell you where the house was where he supposedly lived. But having said that, there was no need for it economically, and so it was not broken up for real estate. And despite the fact that, as you say, there was pushback within the national park and elsewhere because people did covet the real estate, it became a major, magnificent national park, one that I wish we would pour more funding into, because it really deserves it. And they don't have the resources, ironically, that we had when the military was their heavy engineer combat engineer company that could do anything under any circumstances. And at the end of the war with Vietnam, we could wreck places and bring in incredible numbers of refugees and take care of them, because we had that infrastructure that has long since disappeared. But it's a fantastic park, and I'm hoping that I can figure out a way to have my tour. I give tours periodically, historical tours from muskets to missiles, and start in San Diego and work our way up from Spanish colonial times to the Presidio during the Cold War, and maybe a winery or two along the way, and perhaps a mission or two along the way, and recreate that change, literally speaking, boots on the ground from Southern California all the way up to the Bay Area. I have to figure out how to do that, though. To try and get 28 people to get on a bus with me and do that is not going to be easy. But as soon as we're through with this particular podcast, I've got to get off my duff and start crunching some numbers of what it's going to cost to do it.
Oh, I think that would be a great tour. I'm sure you would get a lot of takers. Uh, let's go back. One thing I meant to ask you about, and I forgot, was the 1906 earthquake. How did the Presidio fare during the earthquake?
Boy, that's the big bonus question. The Again, the Army had the wherewithal in those days, as we did in the 1970s for the refugee situation, to get out, to help patrol the streets, to help dynamite areas for backfire purposes, and most importantly, because some of that didn't work as well as one would like, to have areas such as Golden Gate Park and the Presidio to house the people who were no longer able to live within San Francisco because of the devastating fire, more so than the earthquake. And as a consequence, that was a humanitarian effort that is one of the finest hours of the military in the Bay Area, and arguably one of the finest hours of the military in our country that has ever served for those people. With a medical facility there at Letterman had been built as one of the first modern hospitals, pavilion hospitals, literally in the nation. It was really up to date. It had many things, in particular in World War One, had got into reconstructive surgery from all those poor soldiers who were absolutely terribly taken care of during the period of the gas warfare and shrapnel and that sort of thing. And so it was one of the finest hours, providing medical facilities, providing housing areas, such as they were, tents and that sort of thing, food. So things that people desperately needed. And of course, others would come in from other posts. The Navy would step in and other organizations. But it's arguably the finest hour of the Presidio's history.
So it was able to send soldiers out and to help take care of the populace. So I'm assuming that it means that it didn't suffer very much damage itself.
The Presidio itself, except for some of the structures that are, if you go along Montgomery Avenue, which is if you're standing at the flagpole with your back to the flagpole, and look to your west out towards the Fairlawns, those red brick buildings suffered some damage. But everything else was wooden structures that gave with whatever, and even the coastal artillery batteries fared fairly well for their time. And so the Presidio was fortunate enough, like many of the military installations at Angel Island and elsewhere, they didn't suffer the devastation that the city itself did. But again, the real problem wasn't so much the structural problem, was the fires that broke out. And now modern fire systems have been in place in San Francisco that, in theory, allow us to react to such a situation. But at that time, the fires were the devastating thing that really swept through. So it's, to me, the great San Francisco fire of '06, not so much the great San Francisco earthquake of '06.
Right. So then, going back to the book itself, if you had to encapsulate what reading this book does for someone trying to understand California history writ large, what do you think it does for somebody who's interested in California history, maybe doesn't know much about San Francisco or much less the Presidio? What can they benefit from reading this book?
Basically, it chronicles the whole history of California, not just San Francisco. It's through a smaller lens, but it's the same story of San Francisco versus San Diego versus much of California, Spanish, Mexican, the pre-contact people. And the most important thing to me is California has always been made up of diverse people long prior to people speaking Spanish or Russian or anything else. There are 50 some groups in California prior to contact and being essentially decimated, not even decimated, wiped out in many respects. Culturally, linguistically, very interesting place, a mosaic that continues to go on. California continues to be a mosaic of different people. And once again, it's not always about the Pershings, not about the MacArthurs. It's about individuals who we don't even know their names oftentimes. I didn't even know the name of the soldier that that Pershing had at the house until I'm working on a new book on the history of the Ninth U.S. Cavalry, and I found an obscure article about this individual that spending 50 years of my life looking at the Black military experience, and finally, about 2 weeks ago, I found this article. So it's good to be an old man and live long enough to find things that are still exciting to me because a lot of stuff doesn't excite me anymore at this point in my life.
Well, one of the things that is really great about the book is the number of photos that you have. How did you go about researching and finding all of the photographs and maps that are in this book?
I was fortunate enough to spend 7 years roughly at the Presidio as the director of the museum. Founded the museum there, and I'm not a great writer, but I love visuals because I grew up in the days of television, particularly. And I scoured any place in the Bay Area and kept working my way out to the to other places down at the Huntington Library, ultimately the various National Archives resources, and spent much of my years there looking for graphics because having a museum, graphics were an important part of the story. It wasn't just you don't put book on the wall. If you have anything over 30 words in a label, you've lost your audience. So even in the days before we had the technology we had the day to do PowerPoint and such, we had a lot of shows. We use how do you link up three carousels on a Kodak projector with 35 millimeter slides and make them morph into each other, and that was all magic to me. And luckily, we had some great people on our staff. We had a fellow by the name of Brian Chin who worked in Hollywood, who Brian could impersonate anybody in the world if he listened to you for 5 minutes, which was very scary. And Brian would do a lot of voiceovers. We had Don Abenheim, who was later on became a professor, graduated from Stanford with his PhD. Don, brilliant historian. And Ed Green, we had on our staff. Ed, he could take a cup and make spellbind you for 20 minutes on the history of this cup. And when you went away, you wanted to know more. So we had these great people, and those photographs were part and parcel of the individuals and the content. Of course, we had three-dimensional items too. Of course, it was a museum, so we had artifactual material. And we even found some of the old from the fair that had been on out at the island on during the period where Sally Rand was doing her dance and stuff out where the eventually the naval base was and such, Old Goat Island and everything. Um, we found some of the dioramas that had been built by a gentleman who had been in the early film industry, stored in the basement of the Maritime Museum, and we've had those resurrected again by Brian, brought back and found the original designer who was to this day, I'm so upset with myself of never doing oral histories. I met somebody who was stationed there in the Spanish-American War. Found a guy who was new Pershing and was stationed on the border and was a young terrible soldier during the Panama Pacific International Exposition, and who served under Jonathan Wainwright when Wainwright was a young cavalry officer. So the stories of those individuals forced me to try and preserve many of those photographs. And those photographs, fortunately, when the Presidio Museum closed, ultimately ended up in the archives at the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And luckily, too, one of my colleagues, Gordon Chappelle from the National Park Service, Gordon was a pack rat, and he ended up gave me all his collection in his estate, because there's no free lunch. I had to become the trustee of the estate, and that's another nightmare. That's why my hair is gray. But I had the photographs, and so my goal is to not only bring that tour from San Diego to San Francisco this September 17th period, so we can celebrate the 250th of the real 250th of the nation. The heck with that stuff that happened in Philadelphia and elsewhere. But to bring all those materials up to the Park Service and say, what here do you want, before I fill the landfill with all my notes that I've made from Spain, from Mexico, from the
Wow.
National Archives and elsewhere, that I really don't think I'm going to write another book on the Presidio of San Francisco or California history, regrettably.
Well, you mentioned that you are writing another book. What's your next project now?
So my next project is essentially the history of the Ninth U.S. Cavalry. It's the only of the four so-called Buffalo Soldier units that never had a published history back in the 1920s. And I've spent the last 4 or 5 years going through every resource I can find, primary source. I now have about 750,000 words of primary sources and secondary sources that I have to try and get down to about 75 or 80,000, and try and also get some more photographs in there, because I've been bleeding money buying photographs all this time. As you know, we historians are fabulously wealthy. I mean, people, they think the NBA, when they're having the draft, or the NFL, is a big deal. The draft for historians, as you know, is just ruthless. And then they throw all this money at us. Yeah, right. so,
Yeah,
so
the best kept secret.
Absolutely. I only know one or two historians who have made real money, and I won't. I don't think it's us. But having said that, it's the history of the Ninth Cavalry, and then I'm doing a small work for one of my favorite places next to the San Francisco is little town of San Angelo, Texas, has Fort Concho, Texas, and it's phenomenal. It's like a time warp, and the director there has been there for decades, and he has transformed that fort back into, you think you're there back in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s.
Wow.
And I'm doing a photo history book with them. Mostly, they're supplying the photographs, and I'm pretending that I'm a historian and will write some sort of narrative to tie it together.
Well, for sure, if you have time, when your next book comes out, would love to have you back. I think it'll be great to go deeper into that story of the Ninth Cavalry.
Well, I'd love to do that, since there is a tie to California, definitely the Bay Area, the national parks, Sequoia and certainly, and Bill Grant's Park, etc., and ultimately to Monterey. But I will promise you that if I do get up to the Bay Area, you'll have to find all the restaurants I used to love, like Jersey Lil's outside the gate and such, are all gone, and the Officers Club is no longer there, which is probably good, because I probably still owed to Bill when I left. And so you'll have to tell me where the best fun place is, and you and I will go out and tell people how we are the most brilliant historians in the world, and why don't people know that?
It's a deal. Wonderful. Well, Dr. John Langelier, it was really great to talk to you. And as I said, hopefully only the first time. And I do recommend that everybody go out and purchase Bastion by the Bay, the Presidio of San Francisco, from Outpost of Empire to Magnificent Park. It's the 250th anniversary of its founding. What better time to really learn the history of this wonderful place, which is key to the history of San Francisco, but also, as we heard, to the history of this state and this country. So thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. You have a safe weekend, and I hope it is not as hot in San Jose as it is here in my hometown in Tucson.
Thanks again.